Greetings sailors, and welcome to a look, an impression of some of the French destroyers that are being tested at the moment. And it's not really talking about the specific ships. You're going to see a replay of this, the tier 8, Le Fantastique. No, I promised myself I wouldn't do that. It's Le Fantasque, not to be confused with La Fantastique. Completely different ships. And also Mogador, the tier 9. And these are all very definitely work in progress. In fact, the day after the second replay got recorded, they tweaked some of the stats on the live server. They nerfed Mogador a bit more than it had been nerfed already since the first version that we played it with. And I'll get to talking about that, especially as regards the main battery reload speed. And for those of you that have been living under a rock since Le Terrible came out, which was a while ago at this point. Yeah, one of the features of French destroyers as planned and as we see with these test ships is that they have no smoke and they have a main battery reload booster. And the early versions of Le Terrible, the main battery reload booster was brutal. You could basically destroy same tier and maybe even higher tier destroyers from full health. And it was just ridiculously overpowered. And it's still quite powerful. I took a very big chunk of that Gunboat's health and lost a bit myself. And especially for these early game engagements, this is one of the strengths of these ships overall, because they're fast, they can get to the caps early, they're not stealthy, but in this case it didn't matter because there was an island in the way. And if you can get to within visual range of an enemy destroyer and not get shot up by a bunch of cruisers or whatever else might be behind that destroyer, if it's just a one-on-one engagement, then you will almost certainly come out on top. But it's very circumstantial. If you meet multiple destroyers, then you might well be in trouble, because of course if you're firing your guns, you're going to be visible for longer, and you can't just drop a smoke to break contact. You have to run and hope that you don't take too many hits in the process. Everything about these ships as designed at the moment is incredibly circumstantial. If there are carriers in play, that's another major factor, and it is in fact one of the things that a lot of the CCs have been particularly, say blunt about, but they've kind of made that their main point of dissatisfaction with the overall design, is that if there's a carrier in play and they decide to focus you, and there is a carrier in this game, but they're not particularly focusing the destroyers, so that was just sheer luck on my part. But if they do decide to, there is very little you can do about it. I actually have about a half dozen replays that I was from various games I played, mostly in the Mogador, and more than a few of them, just more than a few of the games overall, featured carriers deciding to go after me because my AA wasn't being particularly effective and I didn't have smoke, as they, you know, fairly quickly figured out, even if they didn't necessarily know much about the French destroyer design overall. So you know, it is entirely dependent on, even if there is a carrier, if they go for you, then it just shuts you down totally, because these are not particularly stealthy ships. They've actually heavily nerfed the stealth of the Mogador and presumably the Kleber as well. We don't have that for testing again, but compared to the first test version, it was, I think, 6 point something you could get the best stealth to, and now it's 7.1. And I think the replay you will see, the second replay of this video, is me actually running around with 8.8 stealth, which I think is about on a par with the Minotaur, and presumably the Kleber will be worse than that. You can also get it out to, I think, 17.8 kilometers gun range, but that was fairly useless as an experiment, as I found out. Having a more kind of mid-distance gun range. You still want more than the base gun range, but yeah, having a kind of mid-distance gun range with captain points and equipment placed elsewhere turned out to be more useful. So the overall concept is just very awkward. It doesn't really well jibe with the much increased frequency of characters, carriers especially, and honestly, even if with the changes that even with everything I've said, with the changes that were made to how fire and flooding damage works, and the amount of fire and flooding damage that you can get, if these had come out 2 years ago, with the range that you can get these guns to, they still could have been fairly ferocious. Even with having no smoke, even with the terrible AA, even with how dangerous old-style carriers could still be to destroyers, they could have been really hard to hit, long fire range destroyers that, maybe wouldn't necessarily have the best rate of fire, but they could have been fire-setting devils. They could have been essentially a line of Khabarovsks almost, which I'm not sure would have been the best or most popular thing for the game, but at least it would have represented a viable playstyle. As it is, because these are slower firing guns, when it comes to purely relying on the guns and setting fires with these 139mm guns, outside of the main battery reload booster, which is mostly effective for tackling other destroyers, you can use it against other ships. It's not going to really have the same effect. But if you've got a low health cruiser, for example, and you happen to have an IFHE captain, which I think is probably fairly important for these ships, then yeah, that could actually help you out if you have a situation like that. But otherwise, if you're relying on fire RNG, which I was largely having to for playing a lot of these, the stealth is not great. The torps are good, but they have a pretty limited range, especially at the top tier, to counterset the fact that they are very, very fast torpedoes. And, if you've got 8km torpedoes and an 8.8km surface detection range, then you are never going to stealth drop unless you manage to do it from an allied destroyer or cruiser's smoke. Then you are more or less totally relying on the guns. And so it's extremely awkward because you can either build your ships to get the best possible stealth, which is pretty terrible, and try and make use of those torpedoes. And on the Mogador with the best possible stealth, you've got, I think, 900 meters stealth dropping distance, which you can cover really quickly when you're going at 45 knots, not even using the speed boost. And if you are using the speed boost, then it goes even quicker. And even if you're immediately getting into range as the ship traveling perfectly parallel to you, and you start swinging around to make a turn, it still takes you 720, 730 of those 900 meters just to make a full turn around to be heading the other way again. This carrier was silly, by the way. He gets hit by multiple shells from myself and others on extremely low health, and it's just 0 damage, pens and shatters. I don't think this was IFHE on this captain, which probably made a difference. There's also yeah, hello, that's a Jean Bart, and the carrier tried to drop on us, and it's all getting a little bit frenetic, but yeah. So yeah, you can try and do that. The torpedoes are very, very effective. You could potentially, I suppose, only ever play these as they are at the moment in a division with another destroyer with smoke, and basically stick like glue to your smoke destroyer buddy. And in those circumstances, there might well be times when, yes, you can effectively use those very fast torpedoes. But even then, 8 kilometers is still pretty close, and there is quite a lot of radar around at these tiers. So it's again a very, very situational playstyle. It will work sometimes. There were even times when I managed to use a random teammate's smoke to get a torp hit or two, and it did occasionally pay off. But for the most part, it didn't. I didn't get the opportunity, and I was left using the guns, which if you don't spec for them, outside of fighting other destroyers with the main battery reload booster in use, they're not very effective, despite being the 139mm guns. And so you can go the other way. You can spec entirely for the guns. And when we talk about that, you know, you can either spec for range, or you can spec for max fire damage, or you can spec for HE. There's a number of ways of doing it, but for IFHE rather. And I have tried several of them, and it does seem like IFHE is the best way to go. And I think I'll probably flash on screen at some point the captain setup that I was using for the Mogador game that you're about to see. And this also, by the way, this is just some, I forgot about this, but this is just some random score screens where you could see other games where I didn't really get lucky with RNG and fires and did rather little damage. And this particular game here, that was one where I just got harassed by a carrier the entire game, and we massively lost. That wasn't a particularly fun game. So yeah, if you go for max range, as I've said, 17.8 kilometers, but that's a bit useless because it comes at the sacrifice of your reload time. And the Mogador you're about to see, the base reload is 7.5 seconds. They've nerfed that. It's now 8 seconds. That makes it slower by, I think, a good 1.5 seconds compared to all of the 152mm gun cruisers at tier 9 and 10, and it puts it on a par with some of the tier 8 6-inch gun cruisers. And that really does come down to the main battery reload booster. They've tried to balance around the fire output of that against other destroyers. And of course, the subsequent knock-on against your base reload is rather deleterious. And especially with the lower tiers, when you're not going to have as many guns, yeah, it really is going to severely impact your ability to land lots of shots and to get fires started. This game is going to be the one and only game I've had so far, by the way, where everything just worked out. There's no carriers, there's very little radar, it's a map that is more than big enough for me to run around and use my speed, and most of what I'm facing on this flank is battleships. There's this Fiji, there is one destroyer, and the rest is battleships. And that's going to be fairly important, as you'll see later on. I didn't do that much damage in the Fantasque, and it really was like, you know, our team was just doing overall much better than the enemy team, and it was just, you know, I was going along for the ride and got a bit of damage done, basically. This is maybe much more what the ideal French destroyer game looks like, and it's going to be a very good game, and it might even be the very first game where I was running around just purely concentrating on being a gunboat and actually feeling effective at being so. Because that rate of fire, it leaves you really very dependent on RNG, because these are destroyer-sized shells. You know, they're big for a destroyer. They're almost at the light cruiser-sized shells you see on the early Japanese cruisers, 139 versus 140mm. But even though they do have a decent fire chance for being a destroyer, you don't have the volume of fire that you can get with, say, the Colbert or the Smolensk, which are absolutely brutal compared to this. And that's one of the hilarious other things. This is a complete aside, and I know I'm terrible for these, but they also, with the announcements that they were kind of hot patching the reload to be a half second slower on this, they also announced that the Slava and the battleship they're testing and the Colbert are both getting buffs because reasons. Yeah, no one can quite figure out the current the current changes to the testing ships. So yeah, what I found was this particular setup with IFHE, which does hurt your fire chance. I think I've only got like a 9.5% chance on this. It's not great. The IFHE will mean you'll do more damage against certainly some cruisers. Against destroyers it doesn't matter. You're going to be doing damage against them either way. And so it kind of, you know, it helps, but it maybe doesn't necessarily help me that much in these specific circumstances, because like I said, it's mostly battleships. The Fiji is dead and all that's left is battleships and this Jutland. And so actually I might even have done better if I had more of a demo expert based build instead of, I can't even remember what else I would have put in here. It's a really awkward thing to set up these captains. It's not like really any other set of ships I've played before in terms of the different styles of captain I've tested out. But this also features, I mean, this is, you know, the full 8.8 kilometer surface concealment. In that equipment slot I've got the rudder module 3, and it's not like they have particularly slow rudder traverse to start with, but I tried it out on the recommendation of, I can't even remember who else. I was asking about it in the Discord what setups people had used for their French destroyers, and someone recommended trying that out, and I thought, okay, I'll give that a go. And it shaves, like, I don't know, a second off or something like that. And it just makes the rudder response that bit faster. But when you're trying to madly dodge around the place, you know, that can be very valuable. Range-wise, I think this is AFT, but not the gun range extending module, and I can't remember which one that is now. I think that's in the last slot. You need both AFT and that to get the 17.8 kilometers. Without it, it's just over 15, which is still good enough. It still puts you in the kind of mid-ranges, and when you're fighting battleships like this, then yeah, it's more than good enough. What's happening here right now, though, exposes one of the massive weaknesses of these ships, and that wasn't supposed to be AP. I think I was... I've got one of these mouses, that computer mice that has a keypad on the side, and I occasionally mash the keypad and switch ammo when I don't mean to. Yeah, I can't really do anything to help with this Scharnhorst against the Jutland, because I don't even begin to have the stealth, and it's not a problem that's necessarily unique to this ship. I mean, the some of the Soviet destroyers are similarly, you know, you can build them in a not very stealthy fashion. But yeah, I could try and zoom towards that Jutland, but I'm going to take all kinds of fire if I do. And the Jutland can just smoke, and I can't. And it's a major disadvantage in terms of both cap contesting and trying to scout enemy destroyers for your allies, trying to basically be more team-oriented. Hell, it means you can't even smoke up a low-health cruiser, for example. There have been a couple of times when I've been near a low-health cruiser and had to apologise to them and said, I can't help you, sorry, I don't have smoke. It just doesn't come with these ships. Where it might have bought them some extra life, it might have even bought them time to make a getaway. These are very selfish ships. They're almost more like... I'm trying to think of a suitable cruiser that just doesn't really have any team utility, that's just purely selfishly focused on damage. There probably are examples, like maybe some of the higher tier French cruisers, for example. With the like high tier German cruisers, you've got the Hydro, and American and the US, you've got some combination of AA and radar. But the French don't really have either of those things. You've got the speed boost and the main battery reload, both of which are purely for your own use. So I suppose it's kind of fitting that these are also French and also really seem to fit into that kind of extremely selfish play style. And it's a little bit frustrating when you're playing a destroyer, because there are things you want to be able to do to help allies that you can't compared to other destroyers. And so you come down to playing for yourself, and in this case, you know, the RNG is treating me very well. I've got a bunch of battleships with a lot of hit points to chew through, who have been getting lots of fire set on them, and I have been able to make more fires stick when they put those fires out. This Jutland is definitely still a problem for me, though. I mean, they've got also a very fast rate of fire. They can't speed boost away, but that doesn't really matter to me. I mean, even if they could speed boost, I could catch up to them potentially. Yeah, I mean, overall, this game was looking all right. I mean, I've helped tie up a whole bunch of ships here, But I haven't been able to do anything for my allies. It's just been pure selfish damage. Now, because this was a top tier game, which was rare enough, most of the games were tier 10, because there weren't any carriers, because I had all this, it did turn into a good game for me. But I want to absolutely emphasize, this was the exception. This was the very first game I played where I actually felt this effective. And I can maybe even see if I can... I haven't even thought to do this in advance. This is me just absolutely... doing it on the fly, as it were. But yeah, if I see how many replays I've got, even just for the Mogador, that's okay. That's 13 games, and then there was a couple in Le Fantasque. It was about 3, something like that. So it's overall, like, in terms of numbers, not that many games, and that's just with this version of the ship as well. That's not with the previous unnerved version of Mogador, but that's still a good solid couple of hours of just playing French destroyers. And if you take that, what kind of 4 hours or so, 3 to 4 hours of playtime, I had one enjoyable game, and it was because I got lucky with RNG and not getting a carrier and getting a map that was more than suitable. That doesn't really speak as to these being well-designed ships. And I haven't even really touched on too much, banged on too much about how much it sucks when the carriers are buzzing over you, and like the AA just isn't very good, even with the changes that are going to get made, hopefully. The AA on these ships is just, it's poor. It's average to poor at best. And even a defensive wouldn't help them that much, because defensives don't have a scattering effect. I think it's one of the things that a lot of people have suggested, is that defensive AA brings back either that scattering effect, or else makes it so that people have to aim their air-based attacks for a lot longer whilst a defensive is going, so that the overall accuracy of the attack is therefore decreased unless they spend a really long time getting the maximum aim. This poor Colorado, by the way, I've been in this Colorado's shoes, generally cruisers rather than destroyers pelting me with HE from max range. But yeah, unless I get super unlucky, there's very little this Colorado can do. And while all these ships have been occupied up here, the rest of our team's won the rest of the map and is now pushing up to basically finish the deal. That's not a phrase, but you know what I mean. So overall, yeah, I felt like I wasn't really helping my team when I was playing these ships. If I got lucky with the RNG, then sure, fine, I might get some few tens of thousands of damage. I had some games with getting better torpedo drops where I did a lot better in terms of damage, because the torps are good, but those were really with the stealthier Mogador, when you had close on 2 kilometers stealth drop range rather than less than 1 kilometer. Which it really does make a huge difference. So I don't really know what Wargaming wants out of these. They've given them these really fast short range torpedoes, but made it so that it's incredibly hard to use them. It's risky enough getting close at the higher tiers to use them anyway. But they've also made them really ineffective as gunboats, unless you get lucky with the RNG. Apart from the one specific circumstance of fighting other destroyers up close and personal, if you can get into a one-on-one engagement. And if you can't get that one-on-one engagement, then you're a bit stuffed. And even then, if you get that one-on-one engagement, the other destroyer, unless it's also French, can just drop a smoke. And you can't do a blessed thing about it. and likelihood is you'll still be spotted and they won't, and if they have any allies, they'll probably be shooting at you. If there'd been a carrier at play in this game, if there had been cruisers at play up in this corner other than the Fiji, if there'd been HE cruisers still alive, I probably would not have survived this. As it was, the only real threat in terms of ships shooting at me was that Jutland. And it doesn't really matter that I might die at this point because we've basically won. And I figured they would think I was going around the other side of the island. That's why I did this little loop back. And yep, there they are. I actually damaged them enough in the smoke that, yeah, one final salvo will be all that it takes. So, as a concept for a single premium for Le Terrible, it's like, okay, fine, sure, whatever. It's a bit different. You don't really see people playing Le Terrible, at least I don't on the EU server. It's a really uncommon sight. If these ships come out as they are, with no smoke, with no heal, with a really slow rate of fire, reliant on incredibly unreliable fire RNG, I don't think anyone's really going to play them apart from a few people who will find the playstyle really fun and challenging. Otherwise, you're going to, I think, largely have my experience, which is you will play hours and hours and occasionally have a fun game. And the rest of the time, it's going to be miserable because you had poor RNG or because a carrier decided to pick on you and you could do nothing about it. Like, literally, you can't. You will be hit by every attack that an attack wave has, and you might shoot a few planes down, but you're not going to shoot enough down to stop even a single attack from, like, you know, a tier 8 carrier. You literally just have to sit next to your allied cruisers, battleships, whatever, at which case you might not necessarily even have the gun range to shoot at stuff. You get entirely neutered by the presence of a carrier who is aggressively trying to take you down. It just, I don't know, it just doesn't work. There's too many weird rough edges. Okay, have this be a line of fast, very fast, fire-spitting ships that have weak torpedoes, or have them be, you know, not particularly great at being gunboats, except against other destroyers, but maybe they have more effective torpedoes to use against other targets. Or maybe specialise them more for AA, like the US destroyers once were, and kind of aren't really anymore. But as it is, it's this odd mishmash that just doesn't hang together, and especially doesn't work with how carriers are at the moment. And the fact that they followed through and basically implemented every single thing I didn't like about Le Terrible across an entire line of ships, I don't know, it doesn't work, and I think most people will not enjoy it. I think they will really not enjoy it, and I think if it comes out even close to as is, the test versions that we have at the moment, I don't think it's going to be popular at all. I think it's going to be a class of ships that you see extremely rarely. So that's my take on French destroyers at the moment. Big thumbs down from me. I'm now going to go and play with some of the other test ships now that I've devoted some time to these. I think I'm just about fed up with playing French destroyers, so it'll be a relief to move on to trying some of the other test ships they've given us at the moment. But I will be interested to see what people think, especially people who own and have played Le Terrible, because, yeah, it's basically the same experience as that, and if you were hoping for something different, you're going to be sadly disappointed if they come out as is. Hopefully you found this video useful, and if you have, you can do all the usual things down underneath it, and of course, as always, stay tuned for more.